You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
34% of the Americans who voted in the 2024 presidential election were not affiliated with any party. They were independents. They came close to surpassing the number of Republicans who voted, who were also at 34%. And they did surpass Democrats at 32%. This is a historic high for those who do not affiliate with either party. And it would certainly seem that right now is the time for the rise of the independent. Right now is the time to dismantle this two-party duopoly of American government, and yet that's not what's happening. Quite the opposite, really. Democrats and Republicans collectively still control everything. And why is that? What does it mean for America to embrace independent politics? And is that even likely to occur? What do independents actually want? Is that part of the problem? Are independents just such a loose group of individuals that they don't have a single cohesive vision? Well, I'm joined in this podcast by the president of the Independent Center Lura Forcum. The Independent Center is the nation's go-to organization for information, research, and engagement with independent voters, representing those who are fed up with partisan politics and feel politically homeless. Laura holds a PhD in marketing and consumer psychology from Indiana University, and prior to leading the Independent Center was the director of marketing and communications at the State Policy Network. Now, here at Saving Elephants, I am, of course, decidedly a registered Republican, and even though I find myself alienated and homeless from my own party, I am not one of those who's consistently calling for dismantling the American duopoly system, the American political system that virtually ensures we're going to have only two parties. That being said, I think as you'll find in my conversation with Laura, the idea of being an independent is not just a political party, it's a frame of mind. And there is a lot of crossover that can be shared with the conservative mindset that could be brought to bear to hopefully reform the parties we have today. So with that, I give you my conversation with Lura Forcum.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
You are a doctor of psychology. What can social psychology teach us about this political moment?
The thing that I have been thinking about the most in the past 6 months or so of joining the Independent Center as president is what psychological research tells us about in-groups and out-groups. So there's a lot of this research. It's a huge body of research, but just to really briefly sum it up, over evolutionary history, people had in-groups and out-groups. So your in-group was your tribe, and the out-group was other tribes that you fought with and warred with. And so you can think of in-groups as being people who trust each other a lot and are close to one another, and they're cooperative. I would say those are like the three big things. They know each other, they trust each other, they cooperate with each other. Out groups are people that you compete with. And right, like if you're talking about a tribe and resources 100,000 years ago, that was lethal competition, right? Like it was fighting and taking. And there are very low degrees of trust. And in some cases, there's dehumanization. And so what I see in our politics right now is that we've stopped treating the other political side as part of the larger in-group of Americans, and we've started to view them as an out-group. And so I think a lot of the things that people see the other side doing, it's very tempting to them to attribute those things to like lack of character, lack of intelligence, lack of decency, lack of humanity. Right? When actually what we need to be aware of is like, this is just how we think about out-group members. It has nothing to do with what their characteristics actually are. And the question I've been asking myself and kind of wondering if other people want to ask too is, are you sure you want to treat other Americans like that? Because I think what people need to know is like, this in-group, out-group tendency that we have, I almost wonder if it's like kind of like an alarm or something that's going off in your house where like it's still going off and you don't need it anymore and you're not even sure what it's for. It's kind of like it's drawing from some really negative human tendencies to be violent and dehumanizing. And um, I, I think framing it that way can make it a little bit more relatable to people, and to me kind of suggests like, well, in some ways things aren't as bad as you think, and in other areas, I think people need to be aware that like the the cognitive capacities they're drawing from have these really negative underpinnings.
So it's long been observed that what we are trying to do here in the West, a classical liberal society, society of ordered liberty, is, I think the term I hear very often, is not natural. In other words, it didn't just, if it were natural, we would have expected to have seen it a long time ago. Instead, what we see are warring sort of tribes or monarchies if the state gets big enough, sort of a central authority. And this whole notion of the individual governs themselves and thereby governs society at large is a difficult, not impossible, I think, as our founders have demonstrated, and as the American experiment has demonstrated, not impossible, but nevertheless not natural. It's not normally the way we think and function. And I found it interesting because and by the way, a prior guest, the comedian Andrew Heaton, he wrote his book, Tribalism is Dumb. You and he are not the only ones.
That's a much better summary than what I just said.
I think he said he actually preferred the title that In Our Hearts We're All Just Angry Lobstermen or something like that, because he has an anecdote about how lobstermen were very angry and would self-select. But this is something that runs deep into the heart of a human. And he even explained from an evolutionary biological standpoint, you don't have to buy the evolutionary argument to sort of understand, okay, I get why this is beneficial, why humans are hardwired this way. Maybe there's still some benefits today, I don't know. But obviously there's a lot of detriments that we are currently this way. But I guess what I'm curious about, because you made this statement, is that really how you want to treat other Americans? And it seems like that's usually the answer. How do we get out of this mold? Because if we're talking about an in-group, as Andrew Heaton had said, we humans really only have a capacity for a couple hundred people, or I can't remember what the magic number is. I cannot put thousands and thousands of people in my in-group in the sense that I'm personal friends with them. I might be able to do it if we're both Christian, or if we're both American, or if we're both Republican. Like if we can identify some larger cohesive groups that allow us to identify ourselves as this, it tends to be a bit more functional. And so I guess one of the questions we're all scratching our heads trying to figure out is, well, what's going wrong? Like, we're still Americans, so why is it right now it seems like these cohesive things that used to hold us together are not working like they used to?
Oh, I think that's a great question. It's interesting that you're kind of framing it, because I have this tendency too of like, could we move up a level of abstraction instead of down? So instead of
Right.
saying, well, we're Democrats or we're Republicans and that's the group, could we say, well, we're all Christians or we're all Americans or whatever it is? And I'm starting to think that it might be better in some ways to go to a lower level. So I think if I'm kind of hypothesizing what's driving this really strong in-group, out-group sort of dynamic that we're seeing right now, I think it's a very complicated intermixture of factors. One of the things I think that if it didn't drive it, at least it supports it. It's this idea, or it's the sort of modern online existence. It's the fact that we spend so much time online, and I think it has some. It's maybe not totally intuitive what's happening, but it's sort of like it's gotten easier to spend time online. And when we spend time online, it's also very easy to get into a bubble. And I think there are kind of like frictions that happen when you are dealing with people in the real world. And you have to deal with them in their complexity. You need to understand what motivates them and what they think. It's often not exactly what you think it is, right? Like the person you attribute in your mind is a little bit different than the person who you actually interact with. And so I wonder if we've just kind of gotten addicted to existing in these spaces where everybody thinks like we do. We don't get confronted with complexity and people who are messy and real and three-dimensional. And we're just free to sort of move through the world with people who are either very like us or who aren't challenging the way we think about the world around us. It's almost like our social interactions are just like junk food, right? Where like it's very appealing. It's not very healthy
Right.
though. Right. And so it's this like junk food sort of like existence or social life that I feel like we've built for ourselves. And there are a lot of reasons why we spend so much time online, but I do think that they're driving a lot of this outgroup. It's like we almost don't even have the same understanding of reality because of the bubbles that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, there's so much that could be explained by psychological, say, evolution. Again, I'm not necessarily one to lean on that for all explanations, but it's almost like there's a bug in the human species. We don't know how to handle certain prosperity. We don't know how to handle certain abundance. It's one thing when you're in sub-Saharan Africa and you run across a little patch of berries. You can eat that all day long. You're probably fine. But what if you can eat a Snickers bar every day of your life for the rest of your life? Your body doesn't know how to handle it. And you use this phrase friction, and I think you explain it well, but I want to press on that a little bit because I think that's a very nice way of putting some of the difficulty that happens within the in-group, right? We, to a certain degree, we can choose our families in the sense that we can, of course, when we come of age, leave them if need be. Some families are horrible and abusive, and sometimes for people's mental health, they have to step away. But for the most part, there's a lot of friction inside family, good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just because I got upset with my sibling or something, I'm necessarily going to write them, I'm not inviting them to Christmas unless something that pretty serious takes place. Obviously, that's one of the things that the online community allows us to do. I recall years ago the Babylon Bee posted an article about a persecuted Christian in Iraq that he was going to travel across the minefield because that church in that town had a better child's program. And obviously it's tongue-in-cheek, but it's sort of this notion, because of the abundance, because of choice, because we can self-select with the groups, obviously we're going to do that, right? And it may be impossible to understand over the long term how it could be detrimental to our ability to form a cohesive, say, network, understand people's differences of opinions. It occurs to me, I think, Laura, I'm just repeating everything you said. I don't know if there's so much a question there.
No,
But
no, no.
I want to heighten that idea of friction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your point reminds me of a point that Jonathan Haidt makes where he's talking about barriers to entry and exit in a social setting. And I don't know if this is Haidt's original idea or if he's referencing somebody else's idea, but I think it's really helpful here because, if you think about barriers to exit for a family, right, they're pretty high. Like you're saying, you're not going to disinvite somebody from holiday meals unless things are really destructive and serious, or at least that's been the case over quite a long time. We're
Sure.
moving into this territory of like, oh, we're just not going to talk to this person anymore, right? Like we're going to go no contact with family members. And so I think this idea of barriers to exit is really helpful because, there is there's something to be gained. And I think Wendell Berry writes about this really movingly, not in a social psychology sense, but in a literary sense and in poetry, where he talks about like what it's like to be deeply invested in a place. And I've seen some interesting work from people from all different spheres recently, kind of it's almost like a renewed interest in local life where they're saying there is something to be gained from like really sticking with a place, even if you don't love everything about it, and making it better and being there, even if there are things that you don't like. I feel like this is sort of your objective with saving elephants, right? Is like, you're not saying, hey, I'm done with the Republican Party. You're saying like, hey, there's some things I don't like but I'm not quitting. And I think we could apply that to how we think about our communities and how to larger friend groups. It's particularly, I think, important where you're talking about connecting across difference, that like communities, state and local communities, are really well versed in solving problems because they live there and they need to solve them, right? Like your town needs for schools to operate, it needs to hold elections, it needs roads to be paved. And so the solution to those things is not to move somewhere else. The solution is to say, like, hey, my road is not getting paved. This is a problem. What's going on here? How can we address this? And so I think that's really interesting because, like, it can be fairly significant friction, but people can still work around it. And I think this also gets to the idea you were raising earlier about the American experiment, right? Which is, for a variety of cultural reasons, the American experiment has worked really well in that we've been able to extend trust to outgroup members. I think that's really what's something unique about the American experiment, is that we
Arguably
came up.
more so than any other people group has ever been able to
Yes.
do.
Yes, we came up with a system of government combined with a culture that let us interact with people that we don't know with a fairly high degree of trust. And the problem I think that we're looking at right now is, like, we have a nation of people who are not familiar with what it's like to try and operate in low trust environments. And I think it can be easy for trust to be sort of invisible as kind of it's like a lubricant for American society, right? Both interpersonal and in terms of, like, business and commerce, right? That trust is incredibly important, but it's easy to miss the role it's playing until it's gone. And getting it back is amazing. I don't know anybody who's solved the problem of, like, how do you take a country characterized like very low interpersonal trust and restore trust?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the closest I've ever heard is Yuval Levin's ideas about a time to build, about the necessity of finding ways to reform institutions, in that we look at them as being formative for us and not a platform to display how wonderful we are. But that is necessarily at least multi-year, if not multi-generational project. It can be done. It
Absolutely.
takes a lot of work. And I think a lot of what you guys are doing at the Independent Center and a lot of other organizations, one of the things that gives me hope and encouragement is, much like the problems with social media, at least we're all talking about it. Like, we're aware of you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s. What could possibly go wrong with us connecting
Right.
everyone to everyone? It was all blue sky. And I'm not saying that negativity or dour attitude necessarily is a good thing, but it's at least we've got the cannons pointed in the right direction, right? Some people choose to step out of social media. Some people are trying to find ways to mitigate its harmful effects, but there seems to be more concern about it. And I do think the same is true of our politics, that it does seem that you can transcend. Now, I would say on the fringes, and here I don't mean like MAGA America or AOC necessarily, but the true ideologue, leftist, or the variants on, say, the extreme rights, maybe I'll take out of this conversation, but for the most part, the average American, maybe you could call him an independent, I don't know, we'll get to that. The average American seems to say, look, we disagree on a lot of policies, but we seem to agree something's not working here, and maybe there is some common ground for solutions. And I want to open this up because I think this is a huge conversation that I am very double-minded about this. I think on the one hand, it is true. It is true that now is the time for reform. Now is the time when a lot of very good people, the exhaustive majority, I guess they call us, really do want to buckle down and say, how can we work this out? I think there is also the possibility that we can overread that, and presuming that there may be some cohesiveness or agreement where maybe it's not quite there, because it's kind of like every time every presidential election, you've got the theoretical candidates will do really well. The generic Republican was always going to beat the Democrat. Generic Republican doesn't exist, right?
Yes.
You can see
Small
something
wrinkle.
right. We're all for something until you get flesh and blood or some sort of a physical thing to existence, and then things could break down. And so I don't mean that as an overall critique, perhaps, of an effort to form cohesive solutions to the problem. I guess I just mean I'm wondering what are the potential roadblocks to getting there. And so that's a broad way to set up I'll ask a series of questions along that effect. But let me start here, because it may be the best place to put groundwork. The Independent Center is trying to understand what independents want. So maybe the first thing to ask is, what is an independent?
So the way we're defining independent is basically anybody who's nonpartisan. So these can be people, they might be people who vote for third party candidates, but not necessarily. So independents often will swing vote, right? They delivered the election to Trump in this last election, before that Biden, before that Trump, and they didn't deliver the previous election result to Obama, but they did swing for him. Not in the same sense that they really came out for Trump and were determinative. So there's increasing number of independents over the past 20 years or so, to the point that currently, according to like self-report responses people gave after the 2024 presidential election, it appears that there's 34% independents and 34% Republicans making up voters, and then 32% Democrats. So this is a growing contingent of voters. And sorry, just to go back a second, they swing vote, they also split ticket vote. So they will vote at the top of the ticket one way and lower down other way. And to me, what this just characterizes is, I don't see either party as having all the answers. And that's what we're kind of looking to activate among Americans. We are trying to create a sense of identity of what it means to be an independent. And I think the way a lot of the people we talk to and survey talk about their ideas about politics is like, well, neither side has all the answers. And also, the way that the two sides are behaving right now doesn't seem very conducive to good policy conversations, right? Because it's like, well, if you're a Republican, you have to accept the Republican policy position. If you're a Democrat, you have to accept the Democratic one, and you're not allowed to question it. And the people we meet are just people who are like, well, I have questions. Like, neither one of these seem great to me. And so you end up with this just very like entrenched kind of view of politics. It's winner take all, right? Which I think actually adds to people's nervousness, especially in this really polarized environment, because where you have low trust, saying like one side needs to get their way and that's end of story, that's how policy is going to be decided, I don't think that's very appealing or comforting to most people, right? It's actually, if you're talking about what's hardwired into us, how to feel about outgroups, because there's such low trust, and because in-groups preferentially give themselves more resources. So like, where you see the other side, the outgroup having power, the response is kind of like, uh-oh, I'm not going to get the stuff I need now. Right. And so I think that's part of what's driving this dynamic, where people are like, no, it needs to be my side. I'm only safe if my side wins. If we have a process that's consultative, right, that is trying to come to solutions, bipartisan governing, that would drive trust, in my view, because it would not be this like winner take all. You win, you get your way, end of story, right? It would be like, no, we gotta account for what different groups want. And I can't stay in power unless I account for what makes everybody happy. So I see activating independence as driving a lot of accountability in our political process, right? Because currently, if you're a partisan, then you're happy with whatever your party does. There's really no other game in town. Talk about barriers to exit. You're not going to leave unless things are just terrible. And so it means that you just kind of look at what they go and go, all right, well, these are my guys. Whereas if you're willing to vote, if you're willing to cross party lines, or you're willing to kind of sit in the space in the middle and say, I'm going to look at the issues, I'm going to look at the candidate, that I think produces quite a bit more accountability.
So I'm hearing by that definition, and thank you for that the way I kind of think of independence, it sounds like you're combining two distinct but related ideas. One being the very simple one. An independent is one who does not vote Democrat or Republican. Maybe they have a preference between the two parties. Maybe they tend to vote for one more than the other. Maybe they are registered. I mean, I don't know. By some measurement, maybe I'm independent. I'm still a registered Republican. I still support the Republican Party, but there's a lot of times I don't vote for them because I'm trying to support them. I'm trying to get them off the current train they're on.
Exactly.
So maybe by that definition, someone such as myself could be independent, but it sounds like there's another sense in which there's and I don't know necessarily what words to use here, but almost a willingness to work within small L liberal institutions, almost a sense of, I don't want to say moderation, in that one does not believe passionately about certain policies, or that they don't have some ideological predispositions. But rather, there are some, I'll say air quotes, independents who did not weren't going to vote for weren't going to vote for Joe Biden or Kamala Harris because of the United States treatment with Israel in the Palestine conflict. Or as a single data point, there were some that they weren't nearly socialist enough for us, and so we're independent,
Right.
because they're not left enough for us. So, we see this in the Republican Party too. It's not maybe as common, but certainly at a local level, there are some who, Kerry Lake and who was it? I think J.D. Vance had words to this effect. Sort of, his was more off mic kind of things to the effect of, you are an acronym within the Republican Party if you're still a McCain or a Romneyite or something to that effect. Like there's no place for you here. So I guess I'm kind of curious, because at what point do these two things bump up against each other? Like, as you're defining an independent, could we include the Burning Bros in there who want to burn down the Democratic Party unless we go full core socialist or the equivalent on the right? Or are those not, in your mind, what we would call independent?
So, this is interesting, because this is the question that I get a lot from more astute political observers like yourself, right? Which is basically like, how are we going to know who's in and who's not? And I don't think it's the job of the Independent Center to draw those lines.
Sure.
I think these voters as a block are going to have to decide where the lines are. I can tell you from the research that we've done, what we tend to find, you were mentioning earlier, like they're moderate in the sense of they don't feel like that it's not that they're moderate, that they don't feel strongly, they do. And that's really accurate. They hold values that they don't feel like are espoused by either party. So one of those is fiscal. This is just what we tend to find in our research. They have this kind of view of the economy, which is like, American finances matter. Our fiscal stability matters and is important, and nobody's paying attention to it, right? So like that view isn't represented in a party. And then just a very sort of tolerant, pluralistic way of looking at other people and saying, well, you know what, where your choices don't affect me, I think you should be free to make your own choices. So it is very much this, like, I view this as like, this is a quintessentially American point of view, is classical liberal, just sort of like, people should be free to decide for themselves where it's not harming anybody else. This is what it means to self-govern. And so, that view is also not necessarily strongly represented in either party. So it's kind of like, we need a space where we can kind of come together around our values. And I don't know if over time, I assume over time, independents will have a stronger set of policy positions. But at this point, I think it's still very much emerging as an identity, right? And I think one of the things that is most important about what the Independent Center is doing right now is we're trying to make it more of an identity, because just feeling like, oh, I'm neither party, that's not, I don't think people feel very seen. I don't think they feel a sense of belonging from that way of defining themselves, right? Like if you say I'm defined as being neither Democrat nor Republican, I think people just kind of feel like, oh, great, I'm the absence of something. And the work we need to do is to create this kind of social feel of like, this is what it means to be an independent. And we're not at the point right now where that is a built out platform with policy planks. And I don't see our role as the Independent Center as saying like, here are the planks.
Gotcha. And I appreciate your thinking that sort of long-term strategy, because I think in a lot of ways that was the failure of, and it was never an official movement, but that was the failure, say, of sort of Never Trump, or to some degree, I could even say the Forward Party, kind of this notion of it's somebody pointed out the Forward Party is, and there are good people involved in that, but it's sort of like that speech in The Simpsons, I believe in upward, not downward, forward, not backwards. Like, what does that mean? and certainly you can't be passionate about not believing something, presumably. you have to have something anchored in it. And So those two things, and I have heard you on other podcasts talk about this general notion. I'm going to super simplify this, that maybe we could say, and I get your point. Yeah, we could have in the midst of us hardcore Marxists are independents, and maybe neo-Nazis are independents. But probably, if we're being fair, if we gathered all the truly independent-minded individuals in the United States, most of them are not going to be Marxist or Nazis.
Right.
Most of them are going to be a lowercase liberal in some form of moderation in their approach. And
they're pro-democracy. I think that's
right.
that's sort of the phrase that's not my phrase. It comes from people who work in the independent space, often characterize themselves as being pro-democracy. And what they mean is, if you're thinking about a left-right continuum, they're in the space in the middle versus being outside of either party.
Gotcha.
Like on the farther ends of those two.
Yes, and that certainly helps with the spectrum. I still think one of the many things the French Revolution messed up for us was giving us the left-right scale, because it makes political conversations. I think sometimes that simplicity confuses more than it clarifies. But true. You mentioned two things, and I have heard this a lot, that I rejoice that some of the things you're finding is that there is more an appetite for what I'll broadly call fiscal responsibility, reduction of debt, reining in of spending. Presumably, and one might even be able to argue a cautiousness about tax cuts, possibly even in that mix. I think, and it sounds like equally that there is perhaps I'll say a hesitancy about engaging in the culture war, whether that takes on the flavor of the right or left.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and both of these I think could invite their own series of questions, but I do want to ask you about the fiscal responsibility aspect first, because this always, and I'm trying to think of a good comparison. I can't off the top of my head, but this always seems like one of those things that tends to pull well until somebody bothers to actually run on these matters, and then was like, oh wait, this could cost me. It's like, well, I didn't mean that, and I don't doubt that it's true, but it just seems to me that the sort of politicians that advance an actual fiscal restraint type policies, and there's a variety of them, Paul Ryan, or maybe to a lesser degree Chris Christie, they do well in limited capacities, but at a national level, not so much. And let me just float this out here as a thought. In 2016, when Donald Trump was first running for president, he, if not the only, he was one of the very few of those 19 people up on stage that was essentially willing to just say, look, we're not touching Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We're not doing it. And, to a degree, I applaud the guy for at least being honest about it. He then went on to say, there is so much fraud, waste, and abuse in these programs. We're going to stop that, and we're going to make these solvent, essentially. So the first part I applaud. Okay, you're not doing what most Republicans did, which is we've got to solve this and then do diddly squat when they get into office. The second part, I think, was just horrible, which is he lied to us, saying that somehow if we could just fix the fraud, these $1 trillion programs are going to become financially solvent, which is insane and just not true.
Right.
And so I'm concerned sometimes that what individuals mean by I want fiscal responsibility is a misapprehension with what that might mean. And I think for those individuals who heard that message and gobbled it up, what it meant is you're going to punish the people I don't like. People perpetrating fraud against the system. Yes, let's punish them. And by doing so, we're going to be financially solvent. And so I guess I'm just wondering, is this one of those things that polls really well, but when push comes to shove, maybe people don't mean it?
Yeah, that's a great point. There's so much to say on this front, and I'm not an expert in fiscal matters. I'm not an expert on entitlement. So I just want to say at the outset that my knowledge in those areas is cursory. But I'll tell you kind of some of the things that are encouraging to us. So one of the things is that in our polling, what we see is that Gen Z and millennials are the groups that are most likely to view themselves as independent. And they're also the people who have been told probably their entire lives, you will never see a dime of Social Security. And so in our polling, they're very interested in entitlement reform, because I think what they're looking at is, oh, well, we could talk about it or I could get nothing. Those are my options. And I like talking about it better than I like nothing. So, the fact that it's off the table, according to both Democrats and Republicans, I think it makes no sense. Entitlement spending is the thing that is driving our spending and our deficit. If we're not already there, we're rapidly approaching the point at which our level of debt has an impact on everyday Americans' ability to buy things, and to live their lives and grow families and communities and businesses, right? And all of these things that are important to individuals. So I understand, I don't know if you know Romina Bacha from the Cato Institute. I think she does a really good job of kind of explaining where this conversation goes wrong. But a big part of the problem is the sense that like you're paying into something and you should get that money back out. She explains this much more eloquently than I do, but I understand that people who are currently drawing Social Security feel that they're entitled to that money. But the question I have is for younger generations where they're paying into you kind of say it by habit, right? Where they're paying for retirees right now. It seems like what they're being told is we're not going to talk about this. We're not going to address it. We're just going to let it go off a cliff. And then you'll just be out of luck. And I think what those younger voters are saying, not like, well, we're going to cut off your benefits. We want to cut your benefits. We want to stop paying in. They're just saying, can we have a conversation? Because you guys, if you're retirees, you're baby boomers, you're talking about what you're entitled to by virtue of what you have paid over the years. But we also are paying, and we also should be part of this conversation. So I think there is some interest there in at least like, let's be creative. Let's talk about what the potential options are. Because all that's happening is like our runway is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and we're going to have fewer and fewer options for how we deal with Social Security. And I think if things get really grave, and I know that there are some people who are deficit experts who are concerned about this. My concern is that things could shift really rapidly around spending, where we actually don't even have the amount of runway we believe we do in terms of getting our spending back under control.
Yeah, that to me, that's the great tragedy of this is it, and I'm not an expert either, but from what I understand from listening to a lot of people who presumably are experts, the faster we solve the problem, the better. The longer we wait, the more painful whatever eventual solution would be. And I appreciate that you mentioned millennials and Gen Z, which, by the way, I'm not trying to out your actual age, but do you identify as a millennial?
I am a true cusper between millennials and Gen X. I am 45, so I am either an elderly millennial or a baby Gen X. I don't know. I think I slightly lean towards millennial just because of my texting habits.
That could be. No, I appreciate. Yeah, 45. Gosh, that is. Yeah, you are in that.
I'm right on the edge,
unidentifiable edge between the two. So you get the best of both worlds, I guess. But I appreciate you, and I think it's funny that the Gen X are always the redhead stepchilds because. You mentioned Boomer, you mentioned Millennial, you mentioned nobody
oh, that's true. I left out Gen X. we always
leave them out. But I have wondered sometimes. I appreciate in your answer you divided it per generation because I've wondered how much of our politics really is this underlying mass argument between the Boomers generation and younger Americans. And I'm speaking like a true millennial that I blame Boomers for a good many things, which I say that tongue in cheek. Obviously, we millennials have screwed up a lot of things too. But the entire structure of thinking in binary terms between Republican and Democrat appears to me, and you would probably know with the actual data, to be a far more Boomer idea than it is younger American. And I don't know, sometimes you can make the mistake within generations of not noticing, well, yeah, all younger Americans feel that way. They will 100 years from now. They did 100 years ago, and it's, once we get to be that age, we'll feel the same way. I don't know, but I don't know if that's true, if something's truly changing here. But when it comes to something like entitlement reform, even my friends on the left will often talk about it younger. Now, oftentimes what they will talk about is we need to raise taxes, but they acknowledge the problem. They want the conversation. And it's not just spending. It's all kinds of things that it looks as if the politics of the future is necessarily going to be different because the binary choice makers just aren't going to be there anymore. That being said, what I'm curious about is, do you think that's locked in? Or do you think it just means we're going to break out of the baby boomers mold of sort of this, I'll call it loosely speaking, classical liberal order, the global market, the Clintonian Democrat versus the George H.W. Bush Republican, or maybe W. Bush Republican. And then we're just going to move into a different set of binary factors, maybe your AOCs versus your J.D. Vances. Like, is this just a temporary blip where we're trying to reshuffle things? Or are we truly entering an era where Americans are going to be, nope, I'm just done with this binary thinking?
That's such a great question. That's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. I spend a lot of time thinking about by virtue of my training. So, as somebody trained in social psychology, consumer psychology, I spend a lot of time thinking about how people think. And one of the things to me that's very interesting is, so I'm like pulling from some diverse strings here in the literature and like making my own picture. So, bear with me. One of the things that makes me think we may be seeing a true shift in ways of looking at the world around us. So not just an age effect, like what you were referencing before, is the fact that over the past 20 or 30 years, we've seen in marketing a big drop in brand loyalty. And if you think about party loyalty as being at least partially akin to brand loyalty, it seems possible to me that people just are less likely to go all in on anything, right? So like they whereas you used to sort of be like, oh well, I'm a Sears shopper, I'm a Macy's shopper, right? Like that's where I shop. That's very much something that boomers and the greatest generation would say. That's not something that anybody younger than them says. And so I wonder if there's not this kind of larger cultural shift where people want to make more detailed choices, right? You could think about, I kind of think about this as like people make more granular evaluations of the world around them. So another thing that I notice a lot with younger generations is they're less likely to say something like, "Oh, Elon Musk is great, so everything he does is great." They're more likely to look at him and say, "Well, here are some things that I like or think are interested, and here are some things I don't like." And so that again could be a facet of age. It
Sure.
absolutely could be, right? Where like younger
It could,
people,
by the way, I'm sorry, but it just occurred to me,
yeah,
it could
yeah,
also be a facet of technology that we have the ability
yes.
to examine things at a more granular level.
And that you're used to taking in that amount of information about people around you versus like if you think about somebody who grew up with more like magazines and books and newspapers, right? Like you would have had a lot less granular information about people's behaviors and traits. So you wouldn't have sort of picked apart things that you liked or didn't like. So maybe it's a matter of training, right? And that just the younger generations have trained themselves to evaluate organizations, people, ideas in a different way. But that's something that makes me think that we might be moving away from binary two-party thinking just overall, because, another thing about these younger generations is like having grown up in online digital environments, they're used to a lot of customization and they're used to being able to pick things that very closely match their preferences. And if you only have two parties, then that's not going to be a very high degree of matching, especially given the way that the parties have sort of closed off routes to competition from third parties and made it so that they don't even have to compete for voters, right? Like they assume that they have what they have. They assume independents are going to come home to them. Partisans say that all the time. They're like, oh well, the independents just they are not educated yet, but they'll come to us. They'll pick a side. They're coming, and that to me is kind of ludicrous. Like I don't think that especially in the younger generations, I don't think they're going to come home to a party.
Right. It's certainly, big if true, has yet to happen. As you're talking there, it occurred to me that notion of we meaning younger Americans, I'll count you in that group.
Thank
Younger
you.
Americans are less given to these binary choices, it occurs to me that it extends far beyond parties, because you mentioned brand loyalty and things. And one of the horrible things about the 20th century within the Western world, within the developed world, was its tendency to move so many individuals to fascism, to various forms of statism, to Marxism, to ideologies that could substitute for other sort of philosophies or religions people could find their meaning and purpose in, and that people died for these things and killed for these things in a way that, the 20th century is, I think, to date, the bloodiest century humans have ever gone through.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's incredible.
I believe that's correct. I could be wrong. Maybe per capita, per population, you could argue it was different elsewhere, but certainly ideologies that at the beginning of the century gave rise to this sort of science is giving us the tools we need to perfect humanity, ultimately end up with mass destruction and disillusionment. And certainly see this more in Europe than the United States. But it does seem, I'm trying to think of how to put this, because I'm a conservative, so I naturally look for the bad things to happen in societies. I'm expecting things to fall apart. But I'm wondering to what degree kind of the standard conservative model of when people become disaffected, disillusioned, they're ripe for pickings from a demagogue, from central authorities, for these sort of ideologies to take us up. I'm wondering how much of that may not be true of our moment, because it seems like what we're suffering from isn't so much people out there looking for the next ideology to glom onto. Certainly some do. But it's almost more widespread apathy. It's almost more widespread cynicism, lack of trust, just an unwillingness to form any sort of mass movement. I don't know if that's not good, but I also wonder, is there some hope in that? Is that maybe more conducive to liberty, or the ability to eventually find meaning within your individual lives, instead of some sort of an ideological program?
Yes, I like that idea a lot. I kind of, maybe I'm, sort of selectively seeing the group of independents in the way that I want to, but how I sort of think of their view of the world is saying, or our view of the world is saying, the answer is with us. It's not with an ideology. It's not with a party, right? Like, the answer is in our ability to govern ourselves and solve problems. And, it's funny because there's this massive disconnect between how people live in their daily lives and then what, especially national level politics, looks like,
Yes.
right? Like, it has become this absurd soap opera in Washington of people just behaving abominably. Nobody else acts like this. Nobody talks like this, because, back home where your family is and your neighbors are and your job is, you have to solve problems with people that don't agree with you on everything. And we can do that. We're very good at that. So that gives me a lot of hope. And, the idea that maybe we're talking about individuals who are less likely to say, the answer is X and I'm going to go die for it or shed blood for it. I think that's true. We work with an influencer named Ryan Alford, who said something really interesting. And I think this is really insightful. He was saying that Gen X and millennials, maybe he means Gen X and younger, probably Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, that these are people who are constantly aware that they're being marketed to. And so it makes them very skeptical, because they kind of look at any effort to persuade them and say, like, I see you, I see what you're trying to do, no thanks, right? And so I think that's a big part too of why a lot of them have stepped out of political life, because they listen to the claims being made by parties and by politicians and elected, right, like candidates, and just kind of say, like, I know that's not true. I know you're telling me one side of the story. I know that you are in it for yourself more than for me or for everybody else. And I just don't want any part of this. And so to me, the answer is, well, can we get more people engaged in politics who are gonna kind of require competition and insist on competition and say, I'm gonna hold you to a higher standard, which is not just that you are of my same in-group. Show me how you're solving problems. Show me how you're governing as making us all better off. And to me, that's the biggest hope for improving our current polarization is introducing competition and saying, no, you don't just get to be in a pitched battle with the one other party. Like, all of you are going to have to compete and win votes from people who are just not deeply partisan. And that's the real change that would have a far-reaching effect in American life, I think.
So I'm a big believer that, as a general rule, generations themselves tend to do better at the failures of the previous generation while being blind to their own failures, and maybe overcompensating, if you will. And one of the things that I think is true, and it's kind of embedded what you're talking about there, is this strong drive within younger Americans to demand authenticity anywhere they see it. And certainly politics,
Yes.
we're talking now that, there's that old joke about the politicians saying the trick to politics is to be authentic. Once you can fake that, you've got it made. And so I don't know if it's some people may actually be faking their authenticity, but they're just really good at it. But they're the ones who are doing well, right? And in a certain regard, even though a lot of younger Americans, well, I won't say a lot of, Donald Trump is kind of this odd character because in some sense he's super authentic. He's unlike any other politician. But you could say the same of Bernie Sanders. You could, to a certain degree, you could say the same of Ron Paul back in the day, or AOC now. And I think my concern sometimes is that is a necessary corrective for an era in which our politics was inauthentic, and we kind of got used to being lied to, and then we sort of forgot how to recognize, how to be properly cynical to individuals who claim that they had our best interest in mind. But authenticity, as good as it is not the only data point that makes for a good leader. And I think that we younger Americans struggle with more and more and more. The Western world has lost its sense of sort of religious philosophical moorings, if you will, underlying that we could agree on some certain basic moral frameworks. I don't mean it's completely gone. I guess I just mean that there was far more sense of which, and I'm not saying this just from a Christian, I'll say it from a Christian perspective. The idea that in general you went to church and you kind of believe the same sort of things. It doesn't have to just be Christianity, but that's an example. And it seems like even within something like Christianity, more and more, it's far more about the existential experience, about myself, about authenticity. Is very much the highest virtue of self because you're being true to yourself. About a larger moral framework, maybe there's something better than yourself out there. Like, this just seems something that is potentially very dangerous to set the future on. And because, I don't know, by certain regards, maybe we could say Hitler was a very authentic politician. It's a good, it's like, I think to me, authenticity is like charisma. It's a good quality to have in a leader, but absence other qualities, it actually makes them very dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation about the role of authenticity. And yeah, it's probably serving as kind of a heuristic where people see authenticity and think, authenticity is honesty. Honesty is a good trait. I'm going to go with that. It certainly is an interesting double-edged sword where we find ourselves, right, just really like celebrating authenticity, possibly at the extent to the extent of like damaging your ability to adhere to larger values. I guess this is a question that's far beyond my pay grade, but I do think it's important for people to be authentic. I also think it's important that we're instilling moral values in them for them to be authentic too, right?
Right.
And so being your authentic self when you are at root a narcissist or selfish or
narcissists are very authentic.
That's true. They're very authentic. Well, no, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that. That's outside my my area of study. But I think, it's sort of like it is important to understand yourself and your values, but those values do need to come from somewhere. And where are they coming from? How do we teach them? That is not a problem that I am equipped to solve at all. But I agree with your point, absolutely, that whatever this sort of craving is for authenticity could absolutely go awry. And we need to be, we need more, right? Like, we need to demand more from our politics than that it's just entertaining. And my concern is that what a lot of people think when they say that they are interested in politics, what they mean is something that is far more akin to like village gossip, right? Like, or watching a fight, right? Like, that's not politics, or at least it shouldn't be, in my view. That absolutely, it is a very old human tendency to, to watch the behavior of other people and comment on it and report on it to others, but that's not how we're going to govern ourselves. And that's my concern, is that like so much of what now seems to constitute political life is following what people say on Twitter, and just, campaign rhetoric that never translates to actual behavior, that there's no accountability for how you're actually governing.
So we're coming close to winding down the conversation, but I wanted to take the conversation a slightly different direction.
Okay.
I am old enough to remember the era, George W. Bush around his second term, when we were having serious conversations about, is this the end of the Democratic Party? Also, when Barack Obama was first elected, is this the end of the Republican Party? I strongly suspect the Democratic Party is going to be alive and well and producing candidates that will eventually be president and taking control of Congress again at some point. But it's undeniable they're on their back foot at the moment. So, given your experience in social psychology and the data you have, if somebody puts you in charge of the DNC, what do they need to be doing different in their messaging?
That is a tricky question that nobody has asked me. If anybody from the Democratic Party is listening, call me. I'll be glad to help you fix things. I think there are a bunch of people saying, and I agree with them, that the party needs to move back to the center. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for Democrats to be talking about fiscal responsibility. I know that hasn't historically been a focus of the Democratic Party, but in our polling, we're finding that Democrats have quite an appetite for addressing the nation's fiscal issues. And it was surprising to all of us, because that's not typically what you see or what you expect to hear from the Democratic Party. So I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in Democrat politics, and I have no insight into the inner working of the party. I'm certainly curious as to like why it has been so challenging for them.
Well,
Yeah.
Do you mind if I add to that question right quick? Because maybe this will be helpful. I was listening to a recent podcast of Sarah Longwell of The Bulwark, who does a lot of research focus groups. And it occurred to me, I think part of what the challenge might be is that there's a difference between talking about what is messaging to your rank and file partisan Democratic voter versus the sort of independents you're reaching out to, trying to understand, yes, they're perfectly willing to vote for Democrats, but they're turned off by the Democratic Party. And what she said she had found, because the question was asked of her, like, well, who is winning out? Is it the Bernie Sanders AOC saying we need to be more doubling down on kind of a leftward trend? Or is it those who sort of calling back to an old school, say, establishment, I don't know, Clinton-esque era? And she said, the irony is it's neither. It's really, the real argument is, are you showing us enough aggression? It's not about what are your policy differences. It's, are you showing us you're standing up to Donald Trump? And so that's why Bernie Sanders and the AOC are being applauded for going around the country. And other members. Now, again, to be clear, she's talking about some of those rank and file, very partisan Democrats, that they are looking for the individual who will take the fight to the Republicans the same way they perceive the Republicans have been taking the fight to them. That sounds like it's at complete odds with perhaps what some of your, I'll call them Democrat curious potential voters are looking for.
Yeah. I mean, this is really interesting, this notion of fighting. I think you could fight from a lot of positions. And maybe the issue is that the Democrats have assumed that fighting is more effective the further away from Republicans that it is. But you could certainly be mounting a vigorous attack on the other side on a lot of issues from a position much closer to them. It's interesting to me. One of the things that's been really surprising about the last, in the years since Donald Trump first entered political life in America is that, I can see the effect that he's had on the Republican Party. And I think he has weakened it in the sense of, rather than being a coalition of a lot of different conservative viewpoints, it's now a monoculture of Donald Trump's viewpoint, and that's it. And I don't think that's good for the party. I think to be robust, a party is going to have to reflect shared values, but different values of a large group of people. But the thing that has surprised me the most is that for whatever effect Donald Trump's had on the Republican Party, he has also managed to really derail the Democratic Party, because they don't any longer, they seem to me to have gotten away from the idea of like, here's what we stand for, and here's a defense of our policy positions. And instead, it's just sort of like, well, we're not that guy. Like, what else do we need to say?
Right.
We're just not him. And so I think it's amazing sort of how the extent to which they've been led down that path, right? Of like no longer having their ideas, just being the anti-Trump party. That to me has surprised me. Another thing I would say to Democrats who are not interested in my advice, but just I'll put it out there. I hear a lot of Democrats say, if you were ever a Trump voter, we don't want you here. Like, don't come back. Mm-hmm. If you ever thought that way, like, you're not welcome here. You're not one of us. And I think that's an untenable position. And I understand that they view that as, you've crossed a moral line, and we're not, by supporting this candidate, and we're not open to you returning. I think they're going to have to find some ways to becoming open into that way again, if they're going to continue as a party. And I just think nationally as well, if our politics devolves to the point where you can never come back from whatever party you voted for, like, we can't live like that. So I think that's really important. And then another thing that you mentioned just now made me think of this, because it's kind of come up a couple of times in our conversation. But, you have a candidate like Bill Clinton, right? Or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, AOC, any of these guys, right? And people cast a vote for them. And that vote is like one tiny bit of information. And then we try to take from that tiny yes vote all of this information about what people's preferences are and what they were really supporting and what the mandate is. And that's virtually impossible, I think. And I mean, it explains like why we've gotten so far off base with like, well, what were people voting for when they supported Trump? We really, that question is nearly impossible to answer. And certainly politicians interpret a mandate for themselves, but I think that's wishful thinking, right? Like, that's what they'd like their mandate to be. And then the rest of us look at it and try to figure out, well, like, what did you mean if you voted for Bill Clinton, right? Like, what was that vote really about? And I think maybe we just need everybody to have a little bit more humility in trying to take that tiny little data point and turn it into deep information about voters' preferences and values and needs. And, more than anything else, in the year 2025, we have such robust tools available to us to actually understand what people want and what is important to them. And one of the things I'm really proud of about the Independent Center is that we spend a lot of time trying to understand who these voters are, what they want, what is important to them. And from there, we can say, like, okay, if your biggest issue is affordability, here's how policies relate to that. Here's how policies will translate into, improvements in that area. We're not telling you how to vote. We're telling you, you tell us what's important. We'll tell you how that relates to a policy or a policy area. But the notion that we would just say, here's what you have to believe to be an independent. I think that actually people's appetite for a different political party or experience is more like they'd like to have a conversation and not have it be, are you in, are you out? Are you the good guys or the bad guys? And just this like sort of binary, absurd conversation that we're currently having. And I think part of our mission is, who else could we attract to participate in political life if we made the conversation different? So that, like, we're not going to say, oh, you're a registered Republican, you're not one of us, you're not welcome. No, if you have I think my determining criteria is like, if you feel like you're an independent, if you feel independent minded, you're welcome. Join us. I don't care how you voted. I don't care what's on your voter registration. You're welcome here.
Yeah, there are so many oddities about, it is a very peculiar state of affairs that when a party gets to the point that it's telling people that you don't belong here essentially means when it comes to election day, don't bother voting for us. How's that going to work? But I think too that, I understand the temptation for a party to claim it has a mandate, say, when it wins. But if that were in fact true, you wouldn't experience over the last 20 years, the American people have changed between Democrat, Republican, Congress, and president over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, we're not in an era of mandates. I want to give you an opportunity, signing off, because I know the Independent Center, you guys are doing a lot of work. You're doing a lot of things below and above the radar. But if somebody's listening to this and like, I'm all in, what do you plug them into? You've got a website, and I'll link to that in the show notes, of course. But what else would you recommend the listener get involved with if they're interested in your work?
So we are happy to be a clearinghouse, a source of information for people looking for more information about political independence. Our website is www.independentcenter.org. And actually, it's not super prominent. You can go, when you first load the page, you can sign up for our newsletter there if you like. If you're more motivated, if you're super excited, go to the bottom of the page. There's a place that says get involved. And I would love to hear from people who are political independents or independent minded. Kind of, what's your story? Why is this something that's important to you? What do you need from an independent movement? What are your values? Like, reach out and talk to us. We respond to those comments, and we're happy to connect people with resources. We have a bunch of resources on the website, so it's different to register as an independent in every state. You can't register in every state, I should note as well. But we have resources if you have questions about registering. Are you registered correctly? All of the stuff. We're trying to kind of be a clearinghouse for information. And what we'd like to do next is start meeting with people in person. We'd like to have some small in-person gatherings around the country, just because I think it's important for all of us to spend more time together in person with people who don't think exactly like we do. I think that's healthy. That's getting back to that idea of friction. It's maybe more appealing to kind of stay home and stay in a media bubble where you only see things that agree with you. But there are a lot of rewards to seeing people in their full complexity. And so we need to go back to getting back together in person, I think.
Well, if you guys ever wind up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, look me up. I'd be happy to join you.
I will make sure you're on our list for when we're in Oklahoma.
To be fair, nationally, Tulsa doesn't rank real high. If you're starting a national meet and greet, Tulsa usually doesn't get picked first. But at some point, you'll wind up in Oklahoma, no doubt. But with that, thank you so much for an excellent conversation, and thank you for taking the time to come on the Saving Elephants program.
Thank you, Josh. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.